Volume is super low. Thanks, Narisha. Appreciate that. How am I coming through for everybody else? Can you guys hear me? Better now. Good. Good. Your comments are coming through. Great. Seems like it is getting better. It might be a bit of noise cancellation that happens from time to time. So hopefully I'm going to be clear. Yeah. Hello. Welcome. How's everybody doing? Where are you all tuning in from? Mira and Joburg, Taryn and Pretoria, Chad. I think Namibia, it's moving very quickly, so I'm actually struggling to keep up. Yeah, Chad in Namibia, Callum from Durban. Hello, Callum. Welcome to you. Hello, Sharon from Sunshiny Durbs. That's where I am as well. Yeah, Durbs. It's another nice. Well, I guess we're in spring, aren't we? It's a nice spring day. We're a few days into spring. Clegg from Witbank. Welcome to you. Natalie also from Witbank. Dr. Beware from Pretoria. Hector from Bombela. Nirvana working from home. That's great. Hi, Rosalind from Namibia as well. Ethel Konola from Pretoria. Hi, another Vintuk Pandula. Welcome from outside of South Africa to you as well. What's the weather like in Vintuk? Anchor also from Vintuk. A lot of guys and girls from Vintuk today. That's great. Small Pretoria. Hi, Chantal as well. Hi, Marcia. Romeo from Swakopmund in Namibia. Good all around. Lots of Pretorias, lots of Vintuks and a few Durbans as well. Tobago from Richards Bay. How's the weather up north? Christiana from Mauritius. Fantastic. And then Maputo as well. Mozambique. Cape Town. So good to see so many of you guys from all around. Michaela from Pretoria. Visiting family from Cape Town, missing the cold down there. It's not often, Michaela, that people miss the cold in Cape Town. So yeah, I guess absence making a heart grow fonder and all of that. Is Durban windy, Berenice? I hadn't even noticed that. I'm up here on the second floor, and I haven't really noticed the wind. Normally my building gets buffeted a bit. Just as people join, we're going to get started in a few minutes. Thank you to all of you for your punctuality, as always. Who here is joining again and that you have attended one of these webinars before? If you've attended before, just raise your hand if you could, just to give me an idea of how many of you are new to this. Okay, seeing hands going up. Number of you. I am seeing a lot of familiar names as well, which is great. Welcome back. Okay, good. Yeah, see those hands. Fantastic. Welcome back to you guys who are joining again, and welcome for the first time for those of you who are joining us today for the first time. It's wonderful to have you here. I'm going to be chatting a bit about emotional intelligence, or EQ, today. This is a fairly fundamental topic when it comes to psychological health, when it comes to psychology generally, but our psychological health and the health of our relationships. Emotional intelligence is a really fundamental aspect of that. So a lot of the other conversations we have in some ways kind of builds on this idea of emotional intelligence and emotional regulation. And I think our ability to be well emotionally rests very heavily on our capacity to be emotionally intelligent. And we'll speak a little bit about what that means. So for those of you joining for the first time, my name is James Sturdy. I'm a registered psychological counselor. I am in practice in Morningside in Durban. And I also am part of the Regent Business School Counseling Services. I do student counseling there and staff counseling and a lot of these skills development workshops as well. I've been practicing since 2010, so 15 years now. Yeah, and I am interested in working with couples. I work a lot with couples. I work a lot as well with individuals going through just normal life events, relationship challenges and divorces and trauma. And I deal a lot with anger management and grief. And these are the kind of common areas that I have that I practice in. And yeah, emotional intelligence is kind of foundational to a lot of those things. So yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about what it is today, and I hope that for those of you who are familiar with this topic, we'll get a little bit of a refresher on it. And for those of you who are coming across this idea of what it means to be emotionally intelligent for the first time, I hope that you will be able to take some value from this and be able to practice it in your lives as well, and in your workplaces and in your relationships as well. That's the intention, at least. So there will be time for Q&A at the end. We'll leave some time. We've blocked, as always, for an hour, so we have until 2 South African time. That's 54 minutes from now. And yeah, we'll have some time at the end for questions, but feel free to put any questions in the chat as we go. I'll try to keep an eye on that. There's quite a few of you here, so I might not get everything that's coming through, but I will keep an eye as we go. Anything relevant, I'll try to jump on as well. But yeah, again, there'll be time at the end. Yeah. Shasha Lee, welcome to you. First time. That's great to have you here, and great to have all of you here, especially those joining for the first time from all around. Okay, so it seems like a good place to start. We're talking about emotional intelligence, to get a little bit of a refresher on what are we actually talking about if we're talking about emotions, right? Because that is the foundational concept of emotional intelligence, right? But you might find that this is actually a surprisingly difficult thing to define. Maybe you could try to do it right now. How would you actually define an emotion? What is the description that you would give to an emotion? If you want to put it in the chat, go ahead. I want to see how adept you guys are at describing that. You might find it a bit more challenging than you would have thought. I don't think we often spend time trying to define our emotions in terms of what they actually are. We're just used to experiencing them. Yeah, so Tanith, emotional intelligence, the ability to feel, but also feel for others. Yeah, that's a good definition of emotional intelligence. Specifically with feelings. Yeah, Narisha, so a certain type of feeling, that's a good description. A reaction, Siebel, but I guess you could distinguish between a cognitive reaction, a behavioral reaction, an emotional reaction. These are all reactions. There's something specific about an emotional reaction, right? Fuluflelo, you're talking about how you act based on feelings. So acting is behavior. So the things that we can see, the things that we do, that's our behavior. You can think about psychology as having 3 aspects. So it's our feelings, our thoughts, and our behaviors. And these things are all distinct. They all kind of interact with one another. Our thoughts often make us feel a certain thing. Our feelings often make us think certain things. And both our thoughts and our feelings can then make us act in a certain way. But these are 3 different types of things. And as I think a lot of you are saying, it comes down to feelings, right? That's quite a good general description for what we're talking about if we're talking about an emotion. So what does it feel like? And that's different from a thought. So a thought is a sentence in a way. I'm thinking, it is hot today. That's a thought. I'm angry that it's hot today. Well, that's a feeling, and I can kind of sense it in my body, and it's often a physiological response as well. Yeah, some really nice definitions coming through there. I'm not going to be able to get to all of them, but I'm trying to, just skim through them. Dwayne, that's a nice definition. An emotion is the mind and body's way of evaluating and reacting to situations, helping us to adapt, make decisions, communicate with others. I'm going to hand over the webinar to you, Dwayne. You can take it from here. It seems like you've got the definitions down. Responses. A lot of you are talking about responses, which is true, but there's a little bit more than just that response. So what are we talking about? Essentially, it is it's a psychological state. So it's not just an emotion is not characterized by one thing. It's characterized by a general feeling. And often what happens is we can have a psychological experience of what it feels like to feel a feeling. That's the kind of the feeling of it being in our minds. If you're feeling sad, you might feel quite low. It might be a kind of it might be painful emotionally and psychologically, but there's more than just the psychological experience of a feeling. There's also the physiological experience of a feeling. This is the way that it presents in our bodies, and it's a really interesting thing to pay attention to. And so much of being able to have a healthy relationship with our feelings is to also be able to notice where they are in our bodies as well. Fear you might feel in your chest might be this kind of ball that you feel around your heart. That's a really physical embodiment of that feeling. Sadness can feel like this emptiness, this kind of hole that we have inside of us. Longing for something that can feel like it as well. So it's a really helpful tool to be able to just be mindful about the feelings that we feel physically, and to notice the biological experience of what it feels to feel a feeling, as opposed to just the psychological experience of it. You can kind of separate those two, even though they're obviously very much entangled with one another. You can separate those two, because also what that allows you to do, maybe I'm getting a bit ahead of myself here, but I'll go with it and we'll go back to definition again. But what that allows you to do is to understand that sometimes when we're not paying attention to our feelings, which is we are maybe denying them or suppressing them or trying not to actually go towards the things that cause us emotional pain, just because we're not paying psychological attention to them, which is we're kind of, putting our attention on them, doesn't mean we're not experiencing those feelings in a very physiological way. So there might be something that's happening in my life that's causing me a lot of hurt, and I might have decided that this is too much for me right now, and I just need to actually not focus on it, because every time I think about it, I feel desperately sad. But when I realize, actually, even though I'm not thinking about it, I'm actually probably still feeling that feeling all of the time. I just don't necessarily recognize it as that feeling. And this kind of points to this overall experience of what it means to feel a feeling. It's a mental state, but it's also this very physical experience as well. And we'll get into why that is the case, or why that happens. So as a lot of you were saying, it can feel like it's a reaction, right? It's a response to something that's happening out there in our environment. And as a result, it often feels very spontaneous. So we often don't try and make ourselves feel the way that we feel. It just seems to happen, right? Someone says something and a feeling happens. We're reminded of something, or we experience something, and then there's this kind of spontaneous mental state that arises because of it. It's a very normal part of human experience. As I said, if we think about human psychology, it's about thoughts, feelings, and actions. These three parts are really kind of normal parts of what it means to be human. It's very difficult to just have the cognitive part of it, which is the thinking part of it. Your cognition is really your thoughts, your memory, that type of thing, your ability to pay attention to something, and that's separated from this kind of more fluid, less easy to put words to emotional state that we can have. But it's a very normal part of human experience. And often what we learn quite early on in our lives is that feelings can be messy and painful and scary and overwhelming. And often we're not equipped in the early years of our lives to deal with all of the feelings that life might be challenging us with. And so we can start to develop a resistance to them, or denial of them. We can start to develop avoidant patterns to think, well, every time I allow myself to actually feel something, I feel terrible. And so then we can start to associate feelings with something negative, right? We can say, well, maybe I shouldn't be allowing myself to feel these things. Maybe I should just try to get on with life. And then that starts to distance ourselves from what is just a very normal way of experiencing life and experiencing the world as a human being, which is to feel. And so we get these disconnects then between what we're really feeling and our emotional experience, and then the avoidance of that. When we acknowledge that emotions are part of life, and whether you like it or not, most people are probably going to be fated to feel feelings. That's just part of what it means to be human. And again, we'll get into why that is the case, but we can probably accept that we might not have the luxury of not feeling things, and we can put them off for so long. But ultimately, to be human means we have to grapple with the difficulty of difficult feelings. And not all feelings are negative, but a lot of them are, right? A lot of them are painful, and we would probably, if we could choose, not feel them. But I guess the point I'm coming back to is we might not have that choice. There is a very, very small subset of the human population that you might recognize as, you might recognize the word psychopath. That's not a word that's used anymore in psychology, but this idea of a psychopath is someone who is unable to really feel in the same way that humans typically do. They don't really feel empathy in the same way as well, because they can't really imagine what it's like to be in another person's situation, because they don't really feel feelings in the same way, in the same recognizable way that most of us would feel feelings. But these people are very rare. And so most of the time, if you feel that you're not very emotional, probably more likely that you've learned that. You've learned some type of strategy, and often it's cognitive, intellectual, rational strategies that we learn for not having to feel things. And that's not about being a psychopath. That's just about actually learning to disconnect from feelings. And that can come at a cost, because often, again, there's this whole emotional life and experience that's happening that we might not necessarily be aware of. And not being aware of it means we can't really manage it or deal with it. So why do we feel feelings? That seems like a worthwhile question as well, doesn't it? If I'm saying, well, feelings are part of what it means to be human, well, why should that be the case? Why is it not possible that humans could have maybe evolved without feelings? And I guess the answer is, well, maybe we could have, but in this universe, we're very much feeling animals. So why? Well, there's survival benefits to feeling certain feelings. And what you'll notice about a lot of feelings is that they are powerful drivers of actions. They get us to do something. And there's probably no better example of this than anger. If you're angry, the hardest thing in the world to do is to kind of sit on that anger and not act. This is the gap between emotion and behavior. Feeling and acting, they're not the same thing. And this is a big thing that comes up in anger management therapy as well, is that often we associate the behavior of anger with the feeling of anger. So every time I get angry, I kind of lash out at my spouse and I say something mean, and then I hurt her and I hurt the relationship. So I learn that, well, anger is bad. But actually, what's more problematic there is the behavior. It's what I'm doing when I'm angry. The emotion itself is not necessarily bad. There might be really good reasons I'm getting angry, but it's very hard to stop that anger translating into behavior. And that's because it's driving us to act, and there's a survival benefit to that. If we get angry at something, we're more likely to fight and stand up for ourselves, stand up for what we think is right, defend ourselves or defend the people that we love. And that can be very helpful. And your ancestors who did that were more successful than your ancestors who didn't. And your ancestors who were maybe more peace-loving probably died before they were able to pass on their genes, which I guess by definition means they wouldn't be your ancestors, but they were potential ancestors. So that's a kind of evolutionary process for how we develop things like anger. Fear as well. You can see, anger is making you perhaps fight. Fear is helping you run away from the things that might be dangerous to you. It's a very, very helpful thing to have. If you're afraid of fire, you're going to not fall in the fire. If you're afraid of heights, you're not going to fall over a cliff. If you're afraid of predators, you're going to look all around before you kind of go out of the cave. Very helpful things to have, these emotions. Disgust is a very powerful one as well. Disgust keeps us away from things that might make us sick. Meat that's off, for example, that disgust reaction, oh, that's disgusting, I'm not going to eat that. That was also very helpful for our ancestors, because it allowed them to protect themselves from things that would make them ill, and also disease at the same time. Shame and embarrassment, these are also pro-social emotions. As if a society where people feel ashamed or people feel embarrassed is probably a society where people are going to be more kind of policing of their behavior and maybe act in more pro-social ways. That can be very helpful for society, and society can be helpful for survival and passing on genes. So I'm sure you get a sense for where these might come from. And then the other thing is, those are the kind of the reactions, the behaviors that can come out of emotion, but also emotion helps us bond, and it helps us keep close the people that are important to us. The bonding emotions, such as caring and love, and all of the kind of associated emotions that are kind of under the umbrella of love. Compassion and wanting the best for people who we care for. These are also very helpful as well, and have been very helpful in helping us build families and then tribes and groups and civilization. So lots of good reasons that we feel feelings, but they're complicated. And often because they're complicated and they're painful, we also learn strategies for trying not to feel them. And that can be problematic. Yes, so Nirvana, sorry to hear about your manager, that they're a psychopath. I'm sure a lot of people probably feel that way. Again, psychopaths actually, well, it's called antisocial personality disorder these days, but it's very rare, and often people can be quite good at turning on empathy and turning off empathy. Doesn't mean they can't feel empathetic, but they might be choosing not to. That would be often the situation. Narisha, maybe that goes to the point I'm making. What would you call a person who's capable of turning off feelings? Well, I would call them a human being. That's something that we can do. It's actually a very effective strategy. It's avoidance, it's denial. And again, some people are better at this than others, but often we learn early on in our lives how to turn off our feelings. But there is a price that comes with that. I think that's the point of just trying to drill in. We can do it, but it's not for free. In the same way that if you turn off, it's often helpful to think about pain emotionally as a metaphor for emotional pain, for physical pain. So if you were able to not feel physical pain, and there's some extent we are able to do this as well, we're just less good at it. Hypnosis with highly suggestible people can be quite effective at this. You kind of see people, get in ice baths for hours and they find that type of thing. But if we were able to turn off physical pain, you might think that would be a great thing to have, right? Maybe if I gave you the option right now, you'd take it. You'd say, actually, I'm quite happy never to feel anything painful again. But that comes at a huge amount of unseen consequences for our health. And you see this, I forget what the condition is, but the people who are unable to feel physical pain, they get into all sorts of problems very, very quickly because they don't have any feedback from their bodies in terms of what's happening. So they don't even move when they're sitting. I've just done it right now. We sit for a while and without realizing it, we move. That's a response to some type of discomfort our body's feeling. And just by doing that, we then give that part of our body a bit of a break. Our thighs get a bit of a break. It's not, the blood gets to flow a bit more. If you don't feel pain, physical pain, well, then that doesn't happen. And all sorts of serious muscle atrophies and issues like that can happen. And that's just the normal stuff. The more severe stuff is we might be touching something hot and not know about it, and it can cause severe burns. We might cut our finger and not be aware of it. All of these things are the consequences of not being able to feel physical pain. And then there are analogies to emotional pain as well, which is we will then we might not be able to kind of pay attention to the things that we need to pay attention to. Maybe I should be getting angry about the way that I'm being treated. Maybe the grief and the sadness I'm feeling because of this thing that I've lost, maybe it's worth paying attention to that and understanding it. And maybe that teaches me something about myself, or about my relationships, or about life and death. Maybe these are important things to get. Maybe when I feel afraid when I'm around this person, that's something that's worth noticing and listening to. So there are reasons that we feel feelings, and good reasons to pay attention to those. So yeah, Aquila, psychopaths wouldn't feel embarrassment and shame and guilt to the same extent. They might have a kind of cognitive capacity to understand it, which they might be able to think about it, but they're not going to feel it in that kind of psychological overall state that I was describing earlier. And often what they do in treatment is they learn to just have a kind of cognitive empathy or cognitive understanding of these things. I actually can't imagine what it's like for this person in my life that's there. I can't imagine what it's like for them right now when they're hurting, but I can kind of find a cognitive way of maybe making sense of it in a very rational way. Okay, so we'll move on, but I know there's some good questions coming through. I'm going to try to get to them. Some of them will be at the end. Some of them will be on the scope, so I won't go into all this, but just very quickly, because I think it's relative. How do you control my emotions? The answer to that is you don't. I don't think we should be trying to control our feelings. I think we should be trying to regulate them, which is we notice them, and then we kind of either find ways of down-regulating them, which is getting perspective or acceptance or something like that. But it's not a case of saying I need to kind of put them in jail. It's really our behavior that we want to be more mindful of, and understanding the difference between the emotion and the behavior is important there. And emotions, finally, just in terms of the descriptors, is different from mood. So mood is kind of the overall state of where I am. You can have a low mood or a high mood. A high mood is going to be very energetic and excited and ecstatic. And excessive high mood is like mania, and a very low mood, you're going to be sad and hopeless and despairing and feeling very negative about yourself. So there are emotions that come from different mood states, but mood is more over the kind of general climate as opposed to the actual weather. You can understand that dynamic. Okay, So these emotions are complex. They're often quite hard to distinguish, and they often come in more than one. It's it's quite hard to put a finger on exactly what we're feeling, and sometimes that's because we are not practiced in it, and sometimes it's because it's more than one feeling, and maybe it's being clouded. So there's a couple of things to say about that. I think often it's worth paying attention to the underlying feelings. For example, if we're feeling angry, it's helpful to say, well, why am I feeling angry? What are the feelings underneath the anger? And so often what we find is that there's pain there. I feel rejected. I feel disrespected. I feel powerless. And so I'm kind of acting on my anger. And that's often as well because we learn that anger is a bit more of a socially acceptable behavior and that it doesn't require as much vulnerability. We don't feel as will be judged to the same extent, perhaps, or rejected to the same extent, even. It makes us feel big and powerful. So we kind of learn to maybe express our emotions more through anger than the more vulnerable feelings, such as, I'm actually feeling really scared right now. And so that can become something that we learn over time as well. But it is about practice. If we have spent a lot of time practicing how not to feel and how not to pay attention to our feelings, we become good at it. And vice versa, if we want to notice more how we're feeling, we just have to pay attention to it. And that's not the same as kind of dwelling in the feelings or feeling sorry for ourselves or just becoming, emotional wrecks. I think these are the fears that sometimes people have. It's really just about acknowledging what's really there without judgment. It's just saying, well, let me be honest with myself about the way that I'm feeling. And it's not easy to do. And once again, people will find themselves on different states of this continuum, on this spectrum, and some people are going to be really good at it, and some people are going to be less practiced at it. Often in my counseling sessions, I'll ask someone how they're feeling, and then they'll give me a thought, and then I'll say, well, that's not really a feeling. How do you feel about this thing that your spouse did? And they'll say, well, I think they shouldn't have done that. That's not feeling. Okay, I just think that I wouldn't do that to them. Still not a feeling. And you have to often work quite hard to get to what is the actual feeling. Oh, well, I felt disappointed. I felt betrayed that they did that. I felt completely alone in that. There's practice that can happen there in terms of actually understanding the feelings and differentiating them from the thoughts. There will be recordings of these that'll be up on the employability page, the Regent employability page, just to get to your question, Mercelin. Beneath the anger management is a whole different webinar that we'll do as well because it's so important. But the general principles of emotional intelligence and emotional regulation will apply to that. Grief will make you have a short temper, Vivian. Surely it will. I mean, I think any type of stress, psychological stress, can make us more tolerant in the patients. That's why one way of managing our anger is managing our stress. Sorry, guys, I know there's a lot of questions coming through in comments and looks like some really interesting ones. I don't know. I'm not going to be able to get to all of them, unfortunately, or I won't get through some of these thoughts still. Okay, so there are physiological markers that come with feelings, thoughts, and behaviors. It's not just the psychological experience. It's different from the words, the thoughts that we have as well. And they're very powerful drivers of behavior. And we have them because they help us connect. They will also help us kind of work on in-tribe, out-tribe dynamics, which humans are so evolved to do. We're very, very good to people in our tribes, and we're very, very hostile to people outside of our tribes. We kind of have created a whole lot of tribes in our modern lives now, and you can kind of understand how that affects social dynamics as well. Okay, so those are emotions. What are we talking about if we're talking about EQ, which is the emotional quotient? That's the way of kind of measuring emotional intelligence as opposed to intelligence, which is the intelligence quotient, the IQ, which you're probably aware of. So there's 4 components. Essentially, it's about self-awareness, emotional self-awareness. So it's about being able to answer this question of what am I feeling? Can I put a word to this feeling that I'm feeling? And just a very basic tool that's really powerful is developing a vocabulary for talking about your feelings and for actually labeling your feelings. Because if we don't have a word for it, and it's just this vague psychological experience, it's quite hard to understand. It's quite hard to pin down, and it's quite hard to understand why we're feeling it. And why is such an important question. And why without the judgment? So we don't ask why, implying we shouldn't be feeling it. We ask why because we want to understand where is it coming from? What is it trying to tell me? What am I actually experiencing? What is the truth of my experience right now? So this is this ability to be aware of our own feelings. And that's something we've either learned to do or learned not to do. And most people, honestly, have not done it because they've learned that they don't have to. Avoidance is the most primitive coping mechanism. If something hurts us, we move away from it. And it's the same with emotions. If emotions are hurtful to us, we tend to move away from them unless we are parented in a way when we're young that opens up a space for emotions, that kind of says to us our emotions are valid. We have a right to be feeling the feelings that we feel. Often the message we get is you shouldn't be feeling that. You need to be strong. Stop crying. Get on with it. Don't be weak. That's very powerful messaging that often comes across because it's not easy for a parent to deal with a child's emotions. And often parents are not very adept at that. They don't get trained in that. So that's the first component, is being able to understand our feelings. What am I feeling? Why am I feeling it? Can I put words to it? Can I understand what's going on there? And then it comes down to behavior. So once I have an understanding of that feeling itself, what do I do with it? And sometimes behavior is not behaving as well. That doing nothing is also behavior, and that's an aspect of emotional intelligence. And often with anger management, that's a big aspect of it as well, is to be able to feel the feeling of anger and to not tell ourselves, not to judge ourselves and to condemn ourselves for feeling angry, but to understand, okay, well, I have every right to be angry here. But maybe I can choose to do nothing in this moment, and maybe I can come back to it. So that's the second aspect of emotional intelligence. Okay, I feel a feeling. What do I do? How do I behave based on that? And certain feelings make it easier or hard to do this. If you're happy, you might just find that you can, express that happiness. But if you're feeling very sad, you might feel like, well, you need to hide it. If you're feeling very afraid, you might feel like, I don't, maybe I'm going to leave the situation right now that's causing me discomfort. And that might not be actually serving to you. It might be something that avoidance might be actually, you might pay a price for it, for leaving situations where you're afraid. If you're feeling angry, you might act on that anger. Well, often the normal pattern is people suppress their anger, and then it explodes. So being able to kind of channel that anger into helpful mechanisms to be able to communicate, to use words, to enforce boundaries, or to kind of facilitate communication, understanding, is a very important part of translating that feeling into behavior in ways that are serving to us. The third aspect then is this social emotional awareness. So empathy, we would call it. The ability to have a theory of mind for what's going on in another person's head. This is the idea of theory of mind, which is a really powerful idea, which is we have some type of theory for what it is like to be another person in the situation. And this is not pigeonholing someone, which is, making an assumption about why they're acting in a certain way. We're quite good at that. I think that comes quite naturally, as we often assume that we are the main character in other people's lives. And because they've hurt us, we kind of assume they're doing that intentionally. We assume that they're provoking us. And people do provoke, and people do sometimes act in ways that are malicious, but a lot of the time we're not the main character in their stories. Actually, we're just a side character, and they're just trying to deal with all of their messy emotions at the same time, and all the competing needs and demands that are on them. And sometimes we become collateral damage there. So a theory of mind is being to have some kind of sophisticated understanding of why another person might be acting a certain way. And we don't have to leave it at just an assumption or just a guess. We can use our investigative tools to figure it out. We can ask questions about it. We can be curious about why another person is acting in a certain way, by exploring it with them. But we can get to the point where you can understand, okay, well, perhaps the reason my boss seems like a psychopath is they have so much pressure on them from above that they're so afraid that they're going to fail. And so they've stopped taking that. Stress is translated into them being really ruthless. And because they're acting from such a position of fear, they might have turned off their ability to be empathetic. And let's say that is the case. That's quite a helpful thing to know about someone, because then it allows you to kind of manage the relationship in a way accordingly, based on, okay, well, I think this is probably where this person's coming from. the very key part of emotional intelligence is this ability to be empathetic, which is not kind of, putting our hearts out to what another person is feeling necessarily. It's not to say we have to kind of, experience another person's sadness, or, especially with someone who's maybe feels like they're causing us pain. But empathy just means to be able to imagine what it's like to be that person in that situation. And that then gives us it opens up a whole bunch of options for how we feel about their behavior, and then how we respond to that. So yeah, the fourth aspect then is, once we have that emotional awareness, and this is something we can get better at, then how do we navigate it, right? So what are the tools that we can use? How do we navigate conflict, for example, difficult situations? How do we put up boundaries as a result of that, as a result of an understanding of our emotions, but also being able to recognize the emotions in another person and understand why they might be doing that? How then does that then guide our behavior? So these are the four main aspects of EQ. Daniel Goleman is one of the kind of main popularizers of this idea of emotional intelligence. You can find his book called Emotional Intelligence. It was released in the mid-90s, I think 94, 95, but has been a whole bunch of new releases that have happened up until quite recently, I think the last few years. So if you're interested, you can find his work. But essentially what we're talking about, as you might be starting to kind of get the fuller picture here, is if we're talking about emotional intelligence, we're saying, well, let us take what is a normal part of human experience, your emotions, and let's filter it through the more rational parts of our brain, our ability to think logically. And let's not necessarily give one of them supremacy over the other, but let's allow them to kind of work together in a way that's honest, and acknowledging of reality, but also serving to ourselves. Because we often find ourselves in this tug of war between emotion and reason, right? So emotions are feelings, and then reason, the logic. And sometimes we give supremacy to one or the other. And most of the time, in most people's lives, they're going to prioritize reason. They're going to say that's the most important thing. Is kind of facts and logic and analytical thought. And those things are all really important, but at the same time, they don't stop us from being emotional beings. At the same time, we have to find a way of being able to filter our emotions through our more sophisticated understandings of the world. So that says we don't have to push down our feelings or pretend that we're not feeling a certain thing, but we can use the analytical parts of our brain to really understand our feelings, to be curious about it, to pay attention to those emotions, but then also make choices based on that, right? I might feel really betrayed because you seem to have shared a really private part of my life that I shared with you. Now you've gone and you've told someone else about that. So the emotion is anger, and if I look under that emotion, I feel betrayal. I feel like like I didn't mean anything to you because you just seem to not take my confidence into account. I feel kind of small because and embarrassed, but that this thing's out there. So those are all kind of emotions that are really understandable and real. But then the emotional intelligence, apart from just understanding it, is then saying, well, what do I do with that, right? Do I feed those feelings, which is to kind of build the fire there of outrage and indignation and say, you're such a terrible person and I'm never going to trust another person again? Or do I say, I can understand why you did it? And understanding is not justification, but I can understand how you might find yourself in a situation where you let slip this very private thing that I told you. I don't like it at all. I'm hurt by it, but I'm also going to understand where you might be coming from. And then I'm going to kind of navigate the relationship based on it, right? I'm going to decide maybe I'm going to be a bit more careful about trusting you in the future. And maybe I'll allow you to rebuild that trust or not. I can kind of then use my reason and my logic to then to build on top of the initial emotional response. And that's where we have a lot of control. We have a lot of say over that aspect of it, is how do we then reason with those feelings. So Caleb, what does it mean if you don't feel empathy? Well, number one, you might have a neurologically underdeveloped capacity to do so, but as I said, this is really rare. Most people are capable of feeling empathy, but what you actually are able to do, most people, is you can turn empathy on or off, and that's not a bad thing to do, provided you have some control over it. If you choose, I'm actually not going to be empathetic right now in this situation, but I just don't have the emotional energy for it, that can be quite a protective mechanism to have. If we were never able to be empathetic, well, then we would really kind of struggle in our relationships because we wouldn't understand why people were acting in a certain way. We wouldn't have the imagination to understand why a person might be doing something. We'd probably take everything personally. But also we'd never really connect, and other people wouldn't really feel that we are able to understand them. So it would come at a price. So it is something that we can do. And maybe this is an aspect of emotional intelligence as well. We can kind of turn on our empathy if we choose to say, well, this is a situation where I'm going to actively try to be empathetic. Or this is a situation where I actually just don't have the capacity to do it right now. And that's also okay. So the reason this idea of emotion versus reason is interesting because it kind of gets to these core components of our, you might have heard of this brain versus mind dichotomy. So this idea of brain versus mind, dualism as well, sometimes called. We have these brains which are neurological. They have, I don't know, what, 4 billion neurons in our brains. I think that's what it is. And they kind of firing, and there's synapses and neurotransmitters, and all of these things are kind of happening there, which are crazy. But then we have the experience of what it's like to actually be us, right? We have our consciousness, and we have the thoughts that we have, and the actual experiential aspect of what it's like to be ourselves, and the feelings that come with that. And it can feel like these things are really separated, right? So there's the kind of the biology of our brains, and then there's this more kind of abstract thing of what it means to be conscious. But these things are so interlinked, and understanding that so much of the way that we are is rooted in our actual physiology, our bodies, the kind of wet and warm brains that we have. That can be quite helpful in helping us to understand why we do a lot of what we do, and why we kind of have these quite strange responses. And you see this with stress, and you see it with trauma as well, and kind of respond in ways that are a bit bewildering. But once we understand the mechanisms that are happening there on a neurological level, it takes away some of the mystery, and it makes us say, okay, well, there's actually probably really good reasons that I'm feeling this way that feels quite bewildering or irrational. Maybe there's a really good reason that I do this. That can be quite helpful. So understanding this idea of the intellect versus the emotion is helpful as well. And the way that our brains have evolved have really allowed the way we experience these things to happen in the way that they have, which is to say the older parts of our brains, the old neighborhoods that have been there forever before the newer neighborhoods were developed, those are the emotional parts. So as I was saying at the beginning of this webinar, when we were speaking about why we evolved emotions, there's a capacity to feel an emotional experience that we share with a few amount of animals as well. They might not feel it in the same way. They might not have language to kind of and have a narrative level on that emotion to the same way that we do. But some animals will feel some type of emotion as well, right? And you can see that, in dogs, for example. You can see what seems to be excitement and happiness, and they're kind of a bit more primitive. But there is something there. And I think and this is the point about the old neighborhoods of our brains, the kind of lizard brains, as it were. So there's something there that's more primitive, and it's there because it's a really helpful survival mechanism. You can see it in the middle of that picture there where our amygdala is, our limbic system. That's where the emotions often happen. Tens, hundreds of thousands, millions of years later, this part of our brain up here, prefrontal cortex, this front part here develops, and that's where all of the really kind of higher order stuff happens. Our ability to think, to have language, our ability to rationalize and to think analytically, all of that kind of happens in these higher parts of our brains. This is the executive part. This is where like all of the really cool stuff happens. And often, again, we prioritize the thinking parts of our brain without really paying attention to the more primitive parts of our brain, which is just an emotional experience. And so we can think, well, maybe because the executive parts of our prefrontal cortex, they seem to be kind of, they're the part that has the suit and tie on, and they're more together. We can then start to neglect the emotional part. But once again, we don't really have the luxury of doing that because those parts are all happening at the same time. And often before, when we're taking in information, stimuli from the world, we're kind of processing it on an emotional level first. before we get to the thinking part of our brain. And that, again, that's a survival mechanism. It helps to be fearful before actually rationalizing that fear, because that allows us to then react in a quicker way. And there's so many amazing things that are happening unconsciously with our amygdalas and our limbic systems when we're in a dangerous situation. If we're kind of taking in all this information that's not necessarily making it up into our conscious attention. There's great stories of people who've been hijacked. Not great that they've been hijacked, but there's fascinating stories about the fact that they, whilst being hijacked, the one I remember is, this person was hijacked, and then they're in a busy area, they slammed the car to reverse, and they drove out, and they went backwards, and they were able to go. And they said after, they're like, how did I not know that there was no one behind me? How did I know that I could actually reverse? Because I wasn't aware of who was behind me or not. But actually what they mean is I wasn't consciously aware of it. My brain had been taking in all of that information and processing it without necessarily it reaching the conscious parts of my brain. And that happens all the time to us, as we're taking in all this information. And that's what intuition and intuition is. Intuition is kind of unprocessed information that we've taken in that sits there waiting to be acted on. And so it's helpful to pay attention to kind of gut feelings as well for those reasons. So we feel these feelings initially in the kind of primitive parts of our brain, and then we often feel flooded by them. And then there's often a physiological response. Maybe it's an adrenaline response, maybe it's cortisol, norepinephrine or epinephrine. This is adrenaline that gets released as well. And these often kind of undermine our ability to think clearly. So when we're feeling in a very emotionally flooded way, when we're feeling very angry, it's very hard to think clearly. And this is often why we'll act when we're angry, and then an hour later we'll look back and we'll go, oh my gosh, I can't believe I did that. That's so embarrassing. What was I thinking? And the answer is, well, I wasn't thinking. I was acting on a purely emotional state. So the answer is not to say, well, that part of our response is invalid, but it's to say, okay, it's valid, but I also need to then be bringing in the thinking part of my brain. I need to bring that online when I can, because that's going to help me make sense of what this feeling is. Okay, so Callum, would a fight versus flight reaction be part of EQ? I mean, tangentially, yes, definitely. A fight or flight reaction is your body's, it's your autonomic nervous system. It's a sympathetic response to that. So basically, it's just a kind of physiological arousal, psychological arousal to respond to any type of perceived danger or stress. So yeah, there are definitely feelings that are part of that process as well. Often fear is a big part of it as well. So Nirvana, no, I wouldn't diagnose a neurological condition. You'd need to see an actual neurologist. But often if you go to a counseling session, you are screened for that type of thing. So your therapist will be paying attention to something that might be relevant in that regard, and then they would obviously refer. So yeah, I want to get to questions, but I just want to leave you with this last thought about an amygdala hijack, which is also a helpful way of thinking about how our emotions can be hijacked in these moments, and to probably make some sense of this experience that can happen. So the amygdala is a part of our brain that processes emotions, and it also stores emotions. So it's linked to memory at the same time. So if we experience any type of situation that is associated with a high degree of emotional arousal, so kind of intense emotion, then that experience gets stored in our through our amygdala. So what that means is next time something like that happens, our brain gets flooded with that emotion again. And this is a survival mechanism. And this goes down to, I think it was Callum's question about the fight or flight response. Is there something very adaptive and functional and helpful and survival orientated in being able to remember the dangerous or the painful things that happen to us? Because if we remember the painful things that happen to us, the evolutionary thinking is that, well, then we can try to prevent ourselves from experiencing it again. We can protect ourselves from danger. But this is an example of having an old brain for a new world, right? We have old brains, but our worlds are very different. So we're not dealing with the same stuff that our brains evolved to deal with. But now we're dealing more with kind of social threats, right? Fights with our partner. And so what happens is we get these amygdala hijacks, which is something happens that reminds me of a previous experience. And then I'm responding with anger, even though my spouse right now is just really telling me, that they feel a certain way. I'm now being reminded of a time where I was, young, and I felt very, very powerless, or I was being, punished for something that wasn't my fault, and I feel a very strong sense of indignation and needing to lash out. Now that's being aroused in this current situation. That's often why um, we have very strong reactions to situations. We again look back and think, I don't know why I did that. I don't know why I was so angry at that little thing that happened there. And this is often because we are having what we call amygdala hijacks, and it's a really helpful thing just to pay attention to, um, because once again, when we are experiencing intense emotional experience, it does the survival mechanism there is to not think. This is what you see there in the slide, to disable the higher cortex, the executive functioning. We kind of just give over to action, we give over to feeling. And then it can take minutes, it can take hours sometimes before our thinking brains come back online again. It's often only minutes. And this can be helpful as well, is that if you're feeling a very strong feeling, you notice it, you allow it to pass, and then you also then re-engage the thinking part of your brain, and make sense of it that way. Okay, guys, I think that is enough for today. I hope that gave you an overview of EQ and emotions, and some of these aspects are just really normal human experience. There were questions, as you know, that I was trying to get to. Didn't get all of them though. So, if there's anything relevant that you'd like to chat about now, please put it in the chat. We have 10 minutes or so, so let's do it. Yeah, thank you to you guys. Thank you, Rabia, and Marcia, and the rest of your comments. Then, Natalie, will there be another webinar? Yeah, we'll carry on talking about it. As I said, it's quite fundamental to some of the other stuff we talk about. So we talk about EQ in different ways in the different sessions as well. But there is I think, a webinar on emotional regulation that's very adjacent to it as well, Natalie. Thank you, Debbie. Yeah, Oprah, great question about intuition. So yes, definitely our intuition or our gut feelings can mislead us because they're unprocessed information, right? So it's not to say that we should just listen to our intuition blindly. We should pay attention to it. We should notice it. We should try and make sense of it. We should try and understand why we're feeling a way that we don't really understand. Allow it to guide us, but ultimately we get to make the choices at the end of the day. I don't think it's a case of blindly needing to follow our intuition. Yeah, Narisha, great points. There is an EQ session that I sometimes do more focused on the workplace. So maybe we could do that as a part 2 to this. That's a good idea, to have a bit more EQ in terms of the workplace. These skills are so transferable though. So same EQ skills you'll use in your personal life, you'll use in your professional life, but it'll just look a different way. But ultimately, it's the same process going on. Thank you guys for your comments. Yvonne, yes, so the slides will be on the website as well. The Employability website will be there. If anyone wants to set up a counseling session, you can get me on counseling at Regent. So it's counseling at Regent, AC.za as well. Callum, how does a person's upbringing dictate your EQ? So it's all of it, really. A lot of, there's going to be a fair amount of who we are that's genetic and inherited, but so much of it is going to be environment and how we learn to experience our feelings and the lessons that we're taught about. It's okay to feel feelings, and we learn what works for us, and then we kind of run with it till it stops working. So yeah, upbringing is such an important part of it. Okay, I think I've got other questions. We have a few minutes. I'm just going to keep an eye and see if there's any more. Thank you to all of you. I'm reading your comments. I really appreciate you guys being here. Dealing with an unstable supervisor, Yvonne, that's the question. Yeah, I mean, I'd need details, I think. Feel free to reach out to me if that's something you want to speak about more. It's difficult dealing with people who can feel unstable and predictable as well. But yeah, we do the webinars once a month. There will be a catalog of them, a library of them on the website as well. If you want to go back and see any of the ones we've done already. So, Dumasani, the amygdala hijack is caused by initial experiences where we feel strong feelings. So, you might find that it is. Let me think of an example. You might find that you had a very kind of domineering father, and that every time they would just kind of say your name, it would put fear through you, right? You had some really difficult experiences. Maybe you were young and your father shouted at you, and you were so afraid, even you wet your pants. That type of thing happens to children. Such a strong experience that intense fear, but also shame and embarrassment. That then gets stored. That because it's such the feelings are so intense, your brain saves that, and you'll think about that. You can think about the things you remember from your childhood. Not all of them are going to be negative, but the strongest memories, you're going to, why do I remember that thing right there? Because you forget so much. You have to forget so much, but there'll be things that you remember, and you'll normally notice there's some type of emotion that's associated with them. So our memories get kind of encoded and associated with feelings. And because that happens, then it's stored, and then that's where it comes from. So then, as an adult, let's say your partner speaks to you in a very kind of strict tone, and it causes all of these kind of strong feelings sometimes that you're not even aware of, and all you respond with is just rage and anger. That's an amygdala hijack, and it's going back to that early experience that this hypothetical person had with their parent. Hope that answers your question, Dumasani. Teresa, you can get me on counseling at Regent. Also, all of my details are online as well. You can Google me. I'll put my email address in the chat there. Okay, guys, I think that is it. I'm not seeing any. Whenever do you think narcissist is a battle of emotions or a spiritual battle? I think that these things can be explained psychologically. I don't, the spiritual side of things is not my lane. I don't really know the answer to the spiritual question there. There might be answers there. I'm not the person to give them. But yeah, there are a lot of psychological, psychiatric reasons for narcissism. It's a very well understood condition by this point. There are less narcissists than we think there are, though. I think a lot of, narcissism is something that's very informally overdiagnosed these days. I think anyone who hurts us seems not to be able to empathize towards us. We call them a narcissist. That's just a kind of social moment that we're in. But that's not to say that real narcissists don't exist. For sure we do. Okay, guys, let us leave it there. Thank you so much. Really nice to share some of these thoughts with you, and really good to get some of your comments. I'm sorry if I missed any of them during the chat, but yeah, it's good to get some of the questions as well. And we will pick it up again next month in October. So yeah, thanks once again to all of you, and thanks for attending, and have a good rest of your Wednesday.